Hello, and welcome as we continue our journey through this week in preparation for the third Sunday in Lent, March the 7th, 2021. Today, I'd like to look at the second reading for Sunday, which is 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, verses 18 through 25. So let me read for you the introduction and then what Paul has written, and then share with you some reflections that I have found for this reading. The word of the cross is pure foolishness and nonsense to the world, because it claims that God is mostly revealed in weakness, humiliation, and death. But through such divine foolishness and weakness, God is working to save us. The center of Paul's preaching is Christ crucified. Paul writes, "The message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." Here ends the word. Thanks be to God. The city of Corinth was a very wide open city with a population of about 90,000 people at the time Paul was there, a really large city for them. It was located on a peninsula that allowed sailors, merchants, refugees, and adventurers from all over the world to mix together, blending their customs and their ideas. One commentator describes it as the Las Vegas of the ancient world. It appeared to have adopted a live and let live philosophy, which resulted in an atmosphere of hedonism, that is, pleasure seeking. Having a church startup in that kind of atmosphere would, I think, be even more challenging than any normal city, with the normal in quotes, of course. I once heard a pastor from a church in Las Vegas describe an adult baptism at his congregation. And the woman to be baptized was a chorus line dancer in one of the shows in Las Vegas. Many of the women that she worked with came to her baptism, and they sat in the front row. And in his words, that was one of the best looking groups of people he had ever had visit his church. In addition to the hedonistic side of Corinth, there was also some of the best educational facilities available in that region of Greece. Some of the best minds in the known world would have come there, and subjects from what we would call the humanities would have been discussed and debated out in the squares. Paul's question in verse 20, or his questions in verse 20, are somewhat rhetorical in that regard. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Well, at the very least, there are some of them in Corinth. And what to believe is likely confusing these new Christians. Paul is not going to try to answer all of their questions, which they likely sent a list of questions to him in the form of a letter, and this is a response to that letter that he received. Paul is also not trying to provide some kind of theological treasure map that will guide our human quest to find the divine. One thing Paul does seem to be saying is that human wisdom, knowledge, and academics will not provide the definitive answers. In the cross, God has deliberately chosen to reveal God's own self and unleash divine power whose goal is human salvation. The irony of this divine scheme is that the cross is the last place where humanity would expect to discover God's ultimate wisdom and power. As he writes in verse 18, the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Paul seems to be saying that it should not surprise anyone that the message of the cross sounds like foolishness to people, at least in the first century. In this 21st century USA, at least for those of us who have been Christians for a while, the message of the cross is pretty commonly accepted. Outside of the church, it may be considered foolishness. Yet in the first century Roman Empire, the cross was a shameful way for someone to be executed, and it meant to be a message that this is what happens to people who oppose the Roman authorities. Crucifixion was capital punishment for them. It was inflicted by the forces of the Roman Empire. It was reserved for those disreputable individuals or groups such as rebellious slaves, insurrectionists, pirates, brigands, people who would threaten the divinely sanctioned social order of the Roman Empire. And I say divinely in quotes because the emperor pronounced himself as a son of God. The cross was the imperial instrument used to suppress subversives. It's commonly believed that a public hanging in our old west of this country was something that folks gathered from all around, traveling miles and miles and miles just to witness it. It was said that entire families would come and they would bring a picnic lunch. Street vendors would move throughout the crowd trying to sell their products. As a public spectacle, crucifixion probably attracted the same kind of attention. A crucifixion was an execution geared toward shaming its victim through degradation, humiliation, and often torture before, during, and after the death. At the same time, it was a political statement which declared that all who threatened the imperial social order would find themselves crucified just like this current victim. In some Jewish circles, hanging on a tree could also be regarded as a sign of a divine curse. So it's no wonder that the religious leaders of the Jews wanted Jesus hung on a tree, so to speak. Naturally, Paul would recognize how foolish it would be to say that God's message comes through Jesus' death on the cross. Yet, Paul's writings openly boldly and regularly proclaim the cross as an intentional and exclusive means God has chosen to encounter humanity and to initiate salvation. The cross is the divine activity which both embarrasses and embraces humanity in an exclusive way. In this reading, Paul is addressing people's inclination to control how we encounter God. For that, it was through wisdom and knowledge and education. Paul contends that God says, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart," in verse 19, which is more or less a reflection of what is said in Isaiah 29:14. The proclamation of Christ crucified does not fit such human criteria. It is offensive to the Jewish sensibilities. It was considered a curse by God or from God, and it was foolishness to Gentile intelligence. Yet Paul maintains that God takes what happens to Jesus on the cross and he uses it to introduce the new covenant by which both Jews and Gentiles can be saved. Both Jews and Gentiles are called into relationship with God through the word of the cross. Suddenly, that which outwardly seems moronic and weak, the apparent oxymoron of Christ crucified, becomes divine revelation, divine power, and leads to divine salvation. We do not get to God or find the key to knowing God through our own efforts. Rather, God comes to us, and God establishes the terms of the encounter of faith. And in this case, he uses the proclamation of the cross. God's foolishness in the cross has outsmarted and outmaneuvered human attempts to set the agenda regarding the who and the how of how we will get to God. The proclamation of the word of the cross by Paul and contemporary preachers now and all of the years leading up to this does not impart any new understanding of God. Rather, it provides people with the experience to encounter God in a new way. God displays God's self, God's power, God's wisdom on the cross. The cross always remains, one and the same time, offensive foolishness and divine delight. Thank you for joining me today as we continue our journey toward the third Sunday in Lent. I hope you're having a good day. Take care and God bless.